Young people could serve at home or abroad, depending on their interests and on national needs. At home, they could teach in inner-city schools, work on environmental cleanup programs, plant trees, and help restore and maintain the infrastructure in national parks, much as the Civilian Conservation Corps did in the 1930s. In developing countries, they could contribute in many ways, including teaching and helping to organize family planning, tree planting, and micro-lending programs. This program would involve young people in helping the world, while developing a sense of civic pride and social responsibility. At a more senior level, the United States has a fast-growing reservoir of retired people who are highly skilled in such fields as management, accounting, law, education, and medicine, and who are eager to be of use. Their talents could be mobilized through a voluntary senior service corps. The enormous reservoir of management skills in this age group could be tapped to provide the skills so lacking in failing state governments. There are already, of course, a number of volunteer organizations that rely on the talents, energy, and enthusiasm of both U.S. young people and seniors, such as the Peace Corps, Teach for America, and the Senior Corps. But conditions now require a much more ambitious, systematic effort to tap this talent pool. The world has quietly entered a new era, one where there is no national security without global security. We need to recognize this, and to restructure and refocus our efforts to respond to this new reality. The Great Mobilization, a wartime mobilization. As we contemplate mobilizing to save civilization, we see both similarities and contrasts with the mobilization for World War II. In this earlier case, there was an economic restructuring, but it was temporary. Mobilizing to save civilization, in contrast, requires an enduring economic restructuring. Still, the U.S. entry into World War II offers an inspiring case study in rapid mobilization. Initially, the United States resisted involvement in the war, and responded only after it was directly attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. But respond it did. After an all-out commitment, the U.S. engagement helped turn the tide of war, leading the Allied forces to victory within 3.5 years. In his State of the Union address on January 6, 1942, 1 month after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt announced the country's arms production goals. The United States, he said, was planning to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 6 million tons of merchant shipping. He added, "Let no man say it cannot be done." No one had ever seen such huge arms production numbers. But Roosevelt and his colleagues realized that the world's largest concentration of industrial power at that time was in the U.S. automobile industry. Even during the Depression, the United States was producing 3 million or more cars a year. After his State of the Union address, Roosevelt met with automobile industry leaders and told them that the country would rely heavily on them to reach these arms production goals. Initially, they wanted to continue making cars and simply add on the production of armaments. What they did not yet know was that the sale of new cars would soon be banned. From early 1942 through the end of 1944, nearly 3 years, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States. In addition to a ban on the production and sale of cars for private use, residential and highway construction was halted, and driving for pleasure was banned. Strategic goods including tires, gasoline, fuel oil, and sugar were rationed beginning in 1942. Cutting back on private consumption of these goods freed up material resources that were vital to the war effort. The year 1942 witnessed the greatest expansion of industrial output in the nation's history, all for military use. Wartime aircraft needs were enormous. They included not only fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes, but also the troop and cargo transports needed to fight a war on distant fronts. From the beginning of 1942 through 1944, the United States far exceeded the initial goal of 60,000 planes, turning out a staggering 229,600 aircraft, a fleet so vast it is hard even today to visualize it. Equally impressive, by the end of the war more than 5,000 ships were added to the 1,000 or so that made up the American merchant fleet in 1939. In her book No Ordinary Time, Doris Kearns Goodwin describes how various firms converted A spark-plug factory was among the first to switch to the production of machine guns. Soon a manufacturer of stoves was producing lifeboats. A merry-go-round factory was making gun mounts. A toy company was turning out compasses. A corset manufacturer was producing grenade belts. And a pinball machine plant began to make armor-piercing shells. In retrospect, the speed of this conversion from a peacetime to a wartime economy is stunning. The harnessing of U.S. industrial power tipped the scales decisively toward the Allied forces, reversing the tide of war. Germany and Japan, already fully extended, could not counter this effort. Winston Churchill often quoted his Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. The United States is like a giant boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. This mobilization of resources within a matter of months demonstrates that a country, and, indeed, the world can restructure the economy quickly, if convinced of the need to do so. Many people, although not yet the majority, are already convinced of the need for a wholesale economic restructuring. The purpose of this book is to convince more people of this need, helping to tip the balance toward the forces of change and hope. Mobilizing to save civilization. Mobilizing to save civilization means restructuring the economy, restoring its natural support systems, eradicating poverty, stabilizing population and climate, and, above all, restoring hope. We have the technologies, economic instruments, and financial resources to do this. The United States, the wealthiest society that has ever existed, has the resources to lead this effort. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University's Earth Institute sums it up well. The tragic irony of this moment is that the rich countries are so rich, and the poor so poor, that a few added 0.1% of GNP from the rich ones ramped up over the coming decades could do what was never before possible in human history. Ensure that the basic needs of health and education are met for all impoverished children in this world. How many more tragedies will we suffer in this country before we wake up to a capacity to help make the world a safer and more prosperous place, not only through military might, but through the gift of life itself? It is not possible to put a precise price tag on the changes needed to move our 21st century civilization off the decline and collapse path, and onto a path that will sustain economic progress. But we can at least provide some rough estimates of the scale of efforts needed. As noted in Chapter 7, the additional external funding needed to achieve universal primary education in developing countries that require help, for instance, is conservatively estimated at $10 billion per year. See Table 13-2. Funding for an adult literacy program based largely on volunteers will take an estimated additional $4 billion annually. Providing for the most basic healthcare in developing countries is estimated at $33 billion by the World Health Organization. The additional funding needed to provide reproductive health care and family planning services to all women in developing countries amounts to $17 billion a year. Closing the condom gap by providing the additional 9.5 billion condoms needed to control the spread of HIV in the developing world and Eastern Europe requires $3 billion, $550 million for condoms, and $2.75 billion for AIDS prevention, education and condom distribution. The cost of extending school lunch programs to the 44 poorest countries is $6 billion. An estimated $4 billion per year would cover the cost of assistance to preschool children and pregnant women in these countries. Altogether, the cost of reaching basic social goals comes to $77 billion a year. As noted in Chapter 8, a poverty eradication effort that is not accompanied by an earth restoration effort is doomed to fail. Protecting topsoil, reforesting the earth, restoring oceanic fisheries, and other needed measures will cost an estimated $113 billion in additional expenditures per year. The most costly activities, protecting biological diversity at $31 billion and conserving soil on cropland at $24 billion, account for almost half of the earth restoration annual outlay. Combining social goals and earth restoration components into a Plan B budget yields an additional annual expenditure of $190 billion, roughly one-third of the current U.S. military budget or one-sixth of the global military budget. See Table 13-3. In a sense, this is the new defense budget, the one that addresses the most serious threats to our security. Unfortunately, the United States continues to focus on building an ever stronger military, largely ignoring the threats posed by continuing environmental deterioration, poverty, and population growth. Its defense budget for 2006, including $180 billion for the military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, brought the U.S. military expenditure to $560 billion. Other North Atlantic Treaty Organization members spend a combined $328 billion a year in the military. Russia spends about $35 billion, and China, $50 billion. U.S. military spending is now roughly equal to that of all other countries combined. As of late 2007, direct U.S. appropriations for the Iraq War, which has lasted longer than World War II, total some $450 billion. Economists Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes calculate that, if all the costs are included, such as the lifetime of care required for returning troops who are brain injured or psychologically shattered, the war will cost in the end some $2 trillion. Yet the Iraq War may prove to be one of history's most costly mistakes, not so much because of fiscal outlay, but because it has diverted the world's attention from climate change and the other threats to civilization itself. It is decision time. Like earlier civilizations that got into environmental trouble, we can decide to stay with business as usual and watch our modern economy decline and eventually collapse, or we can consciously move on to a new path, one that will sustain economic progress. In this situation, no action is a de facto decision to stay on the decline and collapse path. No one can argue today that we do not have the resources to eradicate poverty, stabilize population, and protect the Earth's natural resource base. We can get rid of hunger, illiteracy, disease, and poverty, and we can restore the Earth's soils, forests, and fisheries. Shifting 1/6 of the world military budget to the Plan B budget would be more than adequate to move the world onto a path that would sustain progress. We can build a global community where the basic needs of all the Earth's people are satisfied, a world that will allow us to think of ourselves as civilized. This economic restructuring depends on tax restructuring, on getting the market to be ecologically honest. The benchmark of political leadership will be whether leaders succeed in restructuring the tax system. Restructuring the tax system, not additional appropriations, is the key to restructuring the energy economy. It is easy to spend hundreds of billions in response to terrorist threats, but the reality is that the resources needed to disrupt a modern economy are small, and a U.S. Department of Homeland Security, however heavily funded, provides only minimal protection from suicidal terrorists. The challenge is not to provide a high-tech military response to terrorism, but to build a global society that is environmentally sustainable and equitable, one that restores hope for everyone. Such an effort would do more to combat terrorism than any increase in military expenditures, or than any new weapons systems, however advanced. Just as the forces of decline can reinforce each other, so can the forces of progress. Fortunately, the steps to reverse destructive trends, or to initiate constructive new trends, are often mutually reinforcing, win-win solutions. For example, efficiency gains that lower oil dependence also reduce carbon emissions and air pollution. Steps to eradicate poverty help stabilize population. Reforestation fixes carbon, increases aquifer recharge, and reduces soil erosion. Once we get enough trends headed in the right direction, they will reinforce each other. The world needs a major success story in reducing carbon emissions and dependence on oil to bolster hope in the future. If the United States, for instance, were to launch a crash program to shift to plug-in hybrid cars, while simultaneously investing in thousands of wind farms, Americans could do most of their short-distance driving with wind energy, dramatically reducing pressure on the world's oil supplies. With many U.S. automobile assembly lines idled, it would be a relatively simple matter to retool some of them to produce wind turbines, enabling the country to quickly harness its vast wind energy potential. This would be a rather modest initiative compared with the restructuring during World War II, but it would help the world to see that restructuring an economy is entirely doable, and that it can be done quickly, profitably, and in a way that enhances national security, both by reducing dependence on vulnerable oil supplies and by avoiding disruptive climate change. What you and I can do. start loving here. This section of Brown is as nonsensical as the prior chapters are godsend. Brown does a brilliant, authoritative, unassailable job of telling us that the world is coming to an end. We can stop it, and then he tells us we can stop the end of civilization by living normal lives, somehow, at wartime speed. I'll leave his nonsense here, so you can see the madness for yourself, but if I were you, I'd kind of stop here. As for what to do, massive waves